So this is the first public viewing of an interview that is exclusive to Social Value Matters 2020 conference between two brilliant and engaging people. The first of the two, the Right Honourable Paul Martin, was Canada's 21st Prime Minister, and he is interviewing Carol-Ann Hilton, a well-known economist and Indigenous business leader from Canada's West Coast, about her establishment of the Indigenomics Institute and her vision to grow Canada's Indigenous economy to $100 billion annually from its current $32 billion. Paul Martin has a deep understanding of domestic and international economies and business and a genuine passion to improve the lives of Canada's Indigenous people. In addition to serving as Canada's Finance Minister and Prime Minister, he was the co-founder of the G20, bringing together finance ministers and central bankers. Under his leadership, the Prime Minister and the Canadian government reached an historic consensus known as the Kelowna Accord to eliminate funding gaps in health, education, housing, and clean water for Indigenous people. Now out of public office, I'm sure he would agree that what he holds closest to his heart is his family's foundation, the Martin Family Initiative, that aims to improve education, health, and overall well-being for Indigenous children and youth across Canada. Carol-Ann Hilton has established herself as a powerful advocate to ensure Indigenous voices are included in all economic decisions that determine their future, and for the Indigenous economy to reach its full potential, she envisions of $100 billion a year within the Canadian economy annually. As an economist and a visionary, she is working with her Canadian and global institutes to reframe economic and social value through an Indigenous lens. She feels passionately that economic reconciliation will happen when the Indigenous voice is at the decision-making table. I'm really honored and excited to open up this exclusive conversation for you, and I'm certain that you will find it as powerful and enlightening as we have. Thank you very much.
Well, Carol-Ann, let me just say that it is a pleasure to be with you, even though we are many miles apart. As the founder of the Indigenomics Institute, and having coined the word Indigenomics, which I mispronounce an awful lot, could you begin by telling us what is Indigenomics?
Absolutely. Thank you, Paul. Indigenomics is a new word that I've established. The concept is essentially meaning to look and examine Indigenomics as a construct of economics from an Indigenous worldview. So economics has essentially been built from one worldview, and the concept of Indigenomics is to expand the worldview from which Indigenomics is built. The concept emerged as a hashtag on social media and was formed as a way to be able to distribute media narrative stories around Indigenous business success and challenges. As I began to understand and build this content around Indigenous business success, these growing stories started to emerge within this thread of content as having patterns within it. So as we saw challenges within the Indigenous economic relationship with both Canada and with provinces, and with the policies and structures that Canada and the provinces were built upon, what became important to me was to be able to use the concept of Indigenomics as to be able to bring visibility to the growth, the design, and the structure of Canada's growing Indigenous economy. Today, Indigenomics has emerged as a platform for constructive generative economic design. The work of the Institute is to be able to drive a narrative in Canadian consciousness of moving away from seeing Indigenous peoples as a burden on the fiscal system, and instead seeing Indigenous peoples as economic powerhouses. The historical framing of Indigenous peoples in Canada as a problem has emerged from the early words of Canada's first Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, and continued through the Indian Ages and expressed itself in policy that still is in effect today. Utilizing the concept of Indigenomics supports the attention, visibility, and growth of the Indigenous economy, also in a way that supports Canada's GDP overall. So that is a short version of what Indigenomics is. Thanks, Paul.
Well, I think we're going to get, I think that's very good, but I think we're going to get a longer version very soon, because as I understand it, you've just written a book, which is, I'm really looking forward to reading, and it comes out in December. It's titled Indigenomics, Taking a Seat at the Economic Table. Now, what does taking a seat at the economic table mean to you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I believe in this, building this concept of bringing the truth to the visibility that Indigenous peoples were systematically excluded from the economic table of this country. So we look at the reserve systems, the original design of them as established within the Indian Act today. The purpose of the reserve systems was twofold. One, to remove Indigenous peoples from their land bases and the resources, and also to support the economic design of Canada as an emerging country. So if we look at the systemic exclusion of Indigenous peoples, that essentially meant a disinvitation to the economic table that has grown this country over the last 150 plus years. Now, Indigenomics, taking a seat at the economic table, is essentially bringing visibility to a new narrative that the future of Canada is inextricably linked to the systemic Indigenous economic inclusion, its structures, its design, its narrative, and our conscious way that we see Indigenous people. So looking at this legacy of economic exclusion, what becomes important is that Canada's economic success is tied to Indigenous economic success today. It is no longer feasible to establish policy, budgets, or the structures that see Indigenous peoples as a burden on the fiscal system. Instead, how do we make decisions of seeing Indigenous peoples as economic powerhouses? What is important in that concept is the ability of seeing Indigenous economies as constructive and generative, as participating within Canada's GDP. It removes, in essence, only the cost side of the equation, or the federal spend as seen often through the lens of Indigenous reality. What becomes important as well is a shift away from the experience of poverty and negative statistics of understanding Indigenous reality, and instead looking at constructive metrics and meaning of Indigenous economic growth and reconciliation. It's in that concept of the book itself that I write about Indian Act economics, that every single 630 plus Indigenous nations in Canada, that even though some are self-government, modern treaty, historical treaty, or under the Indian Act still, or hybrid versions of that, every single one of those 630 plus nations have been negatively impacted by the Indian Act itself. What is important in this book is that what I also reflect on is that every single Canadian is also impacted by the Indian Act over time. And it's when we understand the constructs and the limitations of Indian Act economics that we can come to terms with the current need for designing Indigenous economic strength and measuring economic strength today. So Indigenomics, taking a seat at the economic table, is being released in December 2020, of which I'm looking forward to immensely. Thank you.
There's no doubt that in what you have said, but that message has got to be sold to young Indigenous people, both men and women, they've got to understand that I'm asking you the question, do you believe what you're saying is the kind of thing that's going to encourage them to come into the business world in far greater numbers than is currently the case?
I think we're already seeing it. I think there's this expectation of the younger generation that the realization of the absence of the Indigenous narrative within the education systems, that the realization that economic reconciliation needs to be naturally formed and shaped within policy. This concept of Indigenous economic inclusion, I believe, has been shaped through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which establishes an environment of inclusion. Now, understanding economic inclusion, its structure, its processes, and investment is really what Indigenomics is bringing to the forefront. I believe young people are very engaged and understand that Canada's future is tied to Indigenous business success fundamentally. I think it's when we see the bureaucratic shift and the conscious narrative shift of actually seeing Indigenous peoples as economic powerhouses is when we can begin to shift that.
Do you think, given what you've just said, now we're at a conference on social value, and obviously many of the people who are listening to us right now are members of that conference. Do you believe that what you have just said is going to be an important part of the Indigenomics method perspective on creating value, that social value?
Yes, absolutely. First, let's examine the Indigenous economy in Canada. TD Bank established rudimentary initial metrics to understand the size of the growth of the Indigenous economy. So in 2010, it was estimated to be around 10 billion. By 2012, it was at 16, and by 2016, it had grown to 32 billion. What I refer to this is hockey stick growth, and we all know Canada loves hockey sticks. And to be able to put a demonstration of the growth of the Indigenous economy as a reflection of the actual rate of growth, what becomes understood is that to be able to construct in economic reality the creation of value in the Indigenous economy, my work here at the Indigenomics Institute is facilitating a narrative to future pace Canada's economic reality on the potential of a $100 billion Indigenous economy. So the difference between the 2016 metric of 32 billion and the potential of a $100 billion Indigenous economy, what we see is that that's $68 billion of potential Indigenous economic activity. How that is supported and grown and its structures enable and leverage capital within the economy are the big questions of Canada that Canada is facing today. I'm often asked how I came up with the $100 billion Indigenous economy. So currently, if Canada's Indigenous population make up just under 5% of the overall population, if we were to correlate that 5% to Canada's GDP, for Indigenous peoples to have a constructive, generative economy, what we see is that that correlation would be a $100 billion Indigenous economy. So instead of seeing Indigenous peoples as a fiscal burden, what essentially emerges now is this narrative of aligning a $100 billion Indigenous economy to Indigenous well-being. So well-being is social value that's creating the constructs of cultural identity, cultural continuity, lands management, and the connection between a $100 billion economy, future pacing Canada's economic reality, and facilitating Indigenous well-being through economy is what Indigenomics is.
What do you think a $100 billion economy? I'm putting that out there and then saying, I mean, this is going to have a huge effect, positive effect on the Canadian economy. What do you think about this in terms of the relationship between the Indigenous and non-Indigenous business business bodies.
Absolutely. I think that there is this very clear perception now that competitive advantage today in industry means that having Indigenous peoples have a seat at the economic table is a strategic advantage. That has emerged from the requirements of consultation and duty to consult. In really understanding the growth of Indigenous economic design, I commend your leadership, Paul, within both the original Kelowna Accord, which I believe is an early construct of Indigenomics itself. So we look at the concept of closing the gap. The early perception of closing the gap was the narrative that Indigenous peoples are falling behind. So today in 2020, instead of seeing Indigenous peoples as falling behind and moving towards seeing as Indigenous peoples as economic powerhouses, what becomes important is how to support the constructs, the structures, and the leverage and design of the Indigenous economy. I understand from your work that you started a foundation, the MFI, which is the Martin Family Initiative, which focuses on Indigenous education. I'm interested if you could tell me a little bit more and what this initiative is currently working on.
Well, in fact, it fits right within the construct that you've just set out, and that is this huge potential growth that exists in terms of the Indigenous economy and how it marries with the Canadian economy. And I think I would even take it one step further. It has to happen. The fact is that the youngest and the fastest growing population in this country are Indigenous people, Indigenous youth. And when you're only 36 million people and you're competing with countries the size of the United States or China, you cannot afford to waste a human talent. In fact, what you really want is for that very large Indigenous population of youth that is coming on the stream, that they do exactly what you just said. But I'm going to give you a couple of examples of where some of the problems lie. This is not only going to be fixed by government, it's going to be fixed by people. And those people have got to be given a chance. There's a reason. Look, I grew up in an industrial town in Windsor, Ontario, where the big automobile factories were, and there was a lot of business. My father was a lawyer. I never thought about going into business. And I don't believe that young people at that age, when they're in high school, think about going into business very, very much, which is one of the reasons that provincial governments years ago began to have high school business courses, grade 10 and grade 11, in which they taught business. Not so much that kids would learn business right away, but that kids would begin to understand that business was an option for them. And it was an option where they could do very well for themselves, but it was also an option whereby they could build for their neighbors and build a stronger Canada. Problem that exists is that while the business courses in the provincial schools across the country basically tell you what to do, but if you're a Canadian from anywhere in the world, except if you're Indigenous, what it really means is there's nothing in there for the Indigenous child or student to be enshrined with. And I can simply tell you a story. We decided that this was wrong. We decided that what we were going to do was to create a high school business course that in fact was based on Indigenous culture, on Indigenous experience, and the kinds of things that young Indigenous men and women, students, would adjust to. And so what we did is we did a pilot project in Northern Ontario for the fly-in reserves up there, and they came because we wanted to see how this would work. And we took the standard course in Ontario. At the end of it, the students were very excited. And so I said finally to one of them, we went to the meeting, I said, what do you think about this? And he said, Mr. Martin, it was really good, but you know, all your examples are in Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, you know, and none of us live in Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver. All your examples were white men. There's a lot of young women in this class. But none of us are white. Are white. We are Indigenous people, and we are totally ignored, and that proved the case. As a result of which, what we then did is we asked 2 of our teachers to take a year off. We went out to the Indigenous business community and said, we want you to come, we want you to moderate this, we want you to give us the examples. And what we did is that we developed a high school business course for Indigenous students. It's 2 years. We have the workbooks, we have the textbooks, and it was our first program, and we are now in 40 schools, 100% Indigenous students. These are largely provincial schools near reserves, and it just took off. And I can tell you that when I go to these schools and I sit down and they start to talk to me, I get a better insight into what the business community of the next 20 years is going to look like from these students than I get anywhere else. And it's marvelous to see. And so the point that I would make to you is, if you want to build the kind of economy that you're talking about, then we've got to do a lot more to reach out to young Indigenous people. This is the youngest, the fastest growing, as you know as well as I do. And if they don't take on to the business world, as many of them want to do, then Canada is not going to succeed to the extent that it can. And we will not fill the dream that you have. And that's one of the programs we got. And at some point, I would like to tell you about another.
Great. Thank you for your leadership in that, and that is so important. And what we are experiencing here in Canada is this visual explosion of the growth of Indigenous entrepreneurship. I believe there was also a 2016 study that identified 43,000 Indigenous entrepreneurs in 2016, and that builds the demonstration of how significant building the structure for Indigenous business inclusion is in the growth of the Indigenous economy and the $100 billion Indigenous economic narrative.
Yeah. What do you think this could mean for Canada's gross domestic product?
I like that. When I served on the Canadian Economic Growth Council under this past Liberal leadership, advising Minister Morneau at the time, we had a figure presented to us that showed, and this was an earlier number, but it demonstrated a total Indigenous spend annually. And what it identified was 95% of that Indigenous spend was social, health, education, management, and 3% was earmarked at the time for reconciliation activities, which left 2% for economic development. When we look at the fiscal equation of that, that does not speak to Indigenous economic design. That's a classic example of the social cart pulling the social horse pulling the economic cart. And when we start to understand that we need a fiscal equation, economic reconciliation must occur within the fiscal equation of this country, that's when we can also begin to understand that the Indigenous economy cannot exist solely within government programs and services. We need to see actual tangible constructs for the growth and design of the Indigenous economy. So looking at an example, the 2020 most recent Canadian budget that was presented, it gave me heart because I began to see actual real constructs of Indigenous economic design. What I saw was the 5% target for Indigenous procurement, which would facilitate $1 billion for Indigenous entrepreneurs if that number was attained. $1 billion towards a $100 billion Indigenous economy is significant. We saw the Indigenous Growth Fund that was facilitated through the National Aboriginal Capital Association. The capitalization of the Indigenous economy is essential for Indigenous participation. We saw funds deployed to Futurepreneur to support Indigenous entrepreneurial growth. When we see the construct of Indigenous design to support growth, that's when we'll begin to actually understand the ratio of Indigenous economic strength, its contribution to Canada's GDP, and a visual reality of growing Indigenous economic strength.
If I could make a suggestion to you in terms of an awful lot has occurred because of the pressures brought from the Indigenous communities. What happened in the Kelowna negotiations is that the Indigenous leadership said, we want you, the federal government, we want you, the provinces, to listen to us. We're going to set the agenda, and we said that would be done. One of the things I must say that I tend to worry a little bit about is that we're facing the digital economy. And if you take a look at where the world is going, the digital economy is going to become really dominant. And it's going to be very important that the education system take this into account. And I think that the more pressure that comes from the Indigenous communities on the digital economy, beginning with connectivity, as you know as well as I do, but also really in terms of education, I think it will go a long way. And I must say that in your definition of the Indigenous economy, I think that the more you are able to put really pressure on that, I think will go a long way.
I just recently saw a metric that identified that 33% of Indigenous communities in Canada do not have access to Wi-Fi. So realizing that future of work and the digitalization of the economy is a significant number that needs to be looked at. I also really, in building this concept of modern Indigenous economic design, what is important to me is that to relay this concept that here in Canada, Indigenous peoples are the only people in the development and the current situation of this country. Indigenous peoples are the only ones who have had to fight for the right to an economy. So if we look at the United Nations on the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, we see that there's the right to self-determination, and that includes a right to an economy. I come from the Nuu-chah-nulth people who took Canada to court at the time and said we had been excluded from our economy as well as the regional economy through the construct of the Fisheries Act. When we begin to understand that the legal argument was Indigenous peoples do not have a modern commercial function, the right to exchange fish for money, what we see is that this legal push-pull relationship that Canada is in with Indigenous peoples, there's been an overemphasis on the legal relationship. And what is required today to grow the Indigenous economy is to balance the relationship so that there's a legal relationship, an economic relationship, and a fiscal relationship. So when we understand the construct and the equations of that balance, the weighted concept of Indigenomics becomes neutral to be able to build and design economy and inclusion from.
You are incredibly articulate, and I think that you're very much on the mark. The Indigenous leadership in the country has done a very good job and is leading this forward. That leadership is going to have to be supported, and you're a lot younger than they are right now, and that by people like you, and the kinds of speeches, the kind of speech that you're making. The question I would really put to you, because within that context, is: do you believe that Indigenous economic growth is really connected to economic reconciliation? Because reconciliation is obviously a dominant factor, and how reconciliation occurs and the role that the economy plays, I think, is crucial. How do you see that?
Absolutely. I draw on this, you may have heard of the Pareto principle, also known as the 80-20 rule. So this rule states that 80% of effects or consequences comes from 20% of causes. When I work at the Institute, and deconstructing this concept of Indian Act economics, it's time to start dealing with the causes of Indigenous economic marginalization, economic displacement, and the concepts of economic regression. So, able to understand Indigenous economic growth, some of the work of the Indigenomics Institute is facilitating concepts such as an Indigenomics Economic Freedom Index. We're beginning to support the design of actual metrics with meaning beyond socioeconomic growth and supporting the evolution of metrics that understand and remove the ratio of dependency. So if we can use in the metrics of Indigenous economic strength and own source revenue as a means to demonstrate the reduction of dependency upon the state, that is also an interception in this concept of seeing Indigenous peoples as a fiscal burden. So economic design essentially must support metrics that move beyond the socioeconomic gap and move towards a country that starts measuring Indigenous economic strength, economic outcomes, and economic performance. That's really where economic reconciliation will happen.
You're working very hard on the development of a global center for Indigenomics. Could you tell us a little bit about that and how you see that playing a role in everything that you've been saying?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, here in Canada, my work has been driving the national $100 billion economic agenda, as well as establishing the Indigenomics Economic Freedom Index. Internationally, I think that the role of Indigenomics, what I see currently is developing a global center for Indigenomics that will house a virtual marketplace. So the concept of marketplace is expanded beyond how you would understand it. So from Indigenous worldview, it would shape a new narrative that returns humanity to the market. So we are the marketplace. So to build Indigenous global networks based on this concept I call the Indigenomics economic mix, which is 12 levers to support the growth and design of Indigenous economy. So some of those levers include trade, procurement, entrepreneurship, capitalization, equity. But when we look at those as tools to support Indigenous economic design, bringing that to a global networked Indigenous marketplace is essentially what the Global Center of Indigenomics will facilitate. And then lastly, what I'm interested in the long run is the establishment of an organization called the I-70, which would be parallel to concepts such as the G7 or the G20, but instead be a collective of the Indigenous-based populations that brings Indigenous worldview to economy and leadership in Indigenous economic design today. So that's some of the work that I do at the Institute, and that's what I'm also developing at an international level. And really just in closing, it's my real message I want to be able to demonstrate is that it's time to stop measuring the socioeconomic gap and start measuring Indigenous economic strength. When we are able to shift towards that construct, this is Indigenomics. It really is time to grow our Indigenous economy. And I end with both a question and an invitation of who wants to play Indigenomics. Thank you, and let's have the courage to do this together. Thank you.
Well, I'm not going to let you close yet. I'm really going to ask. I've got two favors to ask you.
Yes.
One of them is you just talked about the G20, and you talked about whether there shouldn't be a G20 among the indigenous peoples. I had a little bit to do with the starting of the G20, and I'm working quite a bit now with the G20, given the absolute necessity of facing up both to COVID-19 and climate change. There is no doubt that in terms of climate change, the role of the indigenous people can be huge. the whole question of the guardians in Canada, which I'm sure you're aware of, is essentially a demonstration that biodiversity is really an essential part of the Indigenous culture. And I think your concept of a G20 of countries with large Indigenous populations, I think has enormous amount to be said for it. And I will tell you that it's Phil Fontaine, who used to be and who is a friend of mine 25 years ago, and I met in Argentina on much that same idea, but we could not get the Indigenous people under those circumstances in that part of Latin America to come to it. I think that if you were to build upon your idea of a G20 of the Indigenous people, as you expressed it earlier, I think, first of all, there would be a lot of people who would help. There are a lot of people who would find an interest in it. And I think it's the kind of thing that Canada should lead on. And I'd like to leave that with you. That's my favorite number one.
Good.
You want to reply? Because then I'll get to number two.
Absolutely. Well, I welcome your insight, and I think the world needs the concept of an I-70 and the return of Indigenous as aligning Indigenous worldview to economy. And climate change is centered right in there, management of risk. And that's really what the concept of Indigenomics is to be expand into modernity and the relevance of an Indigenous worldview. Thank you.
The one thing that people really do not realize that within the Indigenous culture, and it's obviously the Indigenous culture in North America, but it is around the world, there is an understanding of water, there is an understanding of land, there is an understanding of nature, which is part of the culture. And that is crucial as the fight for climate change occurs, because it's a totally different perspective. And I think that the people best prepared to speak for it are, in fact, are the Indigenous people of this land. That's why I talk to you about it. Now I'll go to the favor. We're really talking about the future of young Indigenous people. The fact is that, and that you know the statistics, they're absolutely terrible. 7%, I think, of the Canadian population, over 50% of children in welfare are Indigenous. We have a program that I think that really is working very, very well. We introduced it about a year and a half ago in a community, or Ermiskin, which is just south of Edmonton. And what it really is given the problems that any young mother will have, that it is creating home visitors from the community, mothers who have been successful in the community, basically working with young mothers to make sure that, in fact, the next generation, I mean, Cindy Blackstock once said that the real problem that many Indigenous people have as adults is making up or compensating for a tough childhood. And I think that is the kind of thing that we can all do together. It's the kind of thing that is obviously, first of all, it's morally right. Second of all, essentially, and this program is doing really well, and I won't take the time to talk about it now, but I'd love to talk to you about it at some point. It is a program that essentially says that every single person counts, and that begins with the day of their birth, and that the most important 5 years of your life are 0 to 5. That's when your brain is formed, and that we cannot afford to continue as we have. I think that if that could fit within your Indigenous philosophy, as it does, because you've alluded to it a number of times, I think that you're going to make a huge difference in the country as it is, but I think you'd make an even greater one.
Yeah, for sure. I really like this concept of intergenerational wealth transfer. How do we focus on a mentality of abundance and removing the constructs of the experience of poverty and negative statistics? So actually building the understanding of how wealth in relationship to lands, territory, resources, water, all of those aspects as a source of well-being. I think when we look at programs as such as what you're speaking to, that becomes important, of building the continuity of cultural identity, and that's really where that wealth transfer to occur. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you have anything else you'd like to add?
I don't. The time went very fast. Thank you.
Well, look, I want to thank you for the conversation. I want to thank all of those on the social values for giving us this chance. It's really been good. I can't think of a better way to pass this afternoon than talking to you.
I am very interested in connecting with your work in establishing the Gs20. I have a lot of questions about that. So at another time, I would love to reconnect with you.
You name it. And whenever you're ready,
Good. Well, I look forward to staying connected with you, and I will send you notes here and there and let you know where the big wins are.
Okay. I look forward to getting them.
Good.
Take care and thank you.
I hope you enjoyed today's session at Social Value Matters 2020. Once again, if you do have any questions for the speakers on today's session, please do ask the questions below in the box, and the speakers will get back to you as soon as they possibly can. On behalf of everybody at Social Value International and Social Value Canada, I just want to thank all of the speakers for the incredible sessions that they've done today, and all of you for attending. We hope that you find the rest of this week's conference as interesting as you found today, and it will see you soon at another one of the events.